The bruise on her cheekbone was the color of midnight, dark purple bleeding into black, swollen enough that her left eye could barely open. Sydney Baker stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror at 5:47 a.m., her fingertips hovering over the damage, but never quite touching it. The pain was sharp, radiating through her skull like electrical currents. But worse than the physical pain was the familiarity of it, the recognition, the acceptance that had settled into her bones over the past 3 years. This wasn't the first time she'd stood in this exact spot, cataloging injuries. It wouldn't be the last. Unless she made it the last. 24 hours earlier, Mark's fist had come out of nowhere. No warning. No escalating argument. No chance to de-escalate or apologize or say whatever words might have stopped what was coming. Just rage disguised as correction, delivered with the force of a man who'd stopped seeing his wife as human somewhere along the way. He'd accused her of disrespecting him in front of his colleagues at the company dinner they'd attended. Her crime? Laughing too loud at someone else's joke. Not his joke. Someone else's. The punch landed before she could even process the accusation, before her brain could catch up to what was happening. She remembered the taste of blood, the way the room tilted, the sound of his breathing, heavy and angry, as he stood over her. And then came the apologies. Always apologies. The tears, his tears, not hers, because she'd learned years ago that crying only made it worse. He begged. He sobbed. He promised on his mother's grave, on their wedding vows, on everything sacred that it would never happen again. He held her face gently, the same hands that had just shattered it, and whispered how sorry he was, how much he loved her, how the stress at work was killing him, and he just snapped. Sydney said nothing. She'd heard this performance before. I had memorized every line. Knew exactly how long this version of Mark would last before the other one returned. Usually about 2 weeks. Sometimes 3, if she was very, very careful. But this time, lying in bed beside him as he slept, snoring peacefully, deeply, the sleep of a man with no conscience weighing him down, something shifted inside her. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No voice from heaven. No sudden clarity. Just a quiet, cold realization settling into the hollow space where hope used to live. This will never stop. Not because she wasn't trying hard enough. Not because she hadn't loved him enough. But because Mark Baker didn't want to stop. The violence wasn't a flaw in their relationship. It was a feature. It was how he maintained control. Sydney lay there in the darkness, eyes wide open, listening to him breathe. Her mind wasn't racing the way it used to after these incidents. It wasn't cycling through the familiar spiral of self-blame and justification. Instead, it was planning. Methodically. Carefully. Coldly. She thought about the pattern they'd been living in for 3 years. The cycle of violence, apology, honeymoon period, then tension building until the next explosion. She thought about the police reports she'd never filed because Mark had convinced her no one would believe her. He was so respected, so charming, so normal to everyone else. She thought about the photos she'd never taken of her injuries because documenting them would mean admitting this was real, was happening, was her life. And then she thought about her sister Rachel. 3 months ago, Rachel had pulled her aside at a family gathering and had seen something in Sydney's carefully constructed facade. Rachel had given her the name of a lawyer, a woman who specialized in cases like hers. Domestic violence, abuse, escape. Sydney had taken a card, had promised to think about it, and then had hidden it in her wallet behind her driver's license where Mark would never look. She hadn't called. She'd convinced herself it wasn't that bad. That Mark was just stressed. That every marriage had rough patches. That she could fix this if she just tried harder, loved better, stopped doing the things that triggered him. But lying in the dark with her face throbbing, with the metallic taste of blood still coating her tongue, Sydney realized something fundamental. Something that cut through every excuse and justification she'd been clinging to. You can't fix a man who doesn't think he's broken. Mark didn't see himself as an abuser. He saw himself as a husband dealing with a difficult wife. The violence wasn't his responsibility, it was hers. She'd caused it. She'd made him do it. And that meant he would never, ever change. The next morning, Sydney woke before dawn. The house was still dark, still quiet. She moved like a ghost through rooms that no longer felt like home, her body trained by years of walking on eggshells, of making herself invisible, of taking up as little space as possible. She pulled on a silk scarf, soft and expensive, a gift for Mark after the last time, and arranged it carefully to hide most of the bruising. What the scarf couldn't cover, she buried under layers of makeup. Foundation, concealer, powder. She built a mask over her mask until she looked almost normal, almost human, almost like a woman who hadn't been beaten by her husband 18 hours earlier. In the kitchen, she moved with quiet purpose. Coffee brewing, the rich smell filling the air like this was any other morning. Eggs cracking into the pan, yolks bright yellow and perfect. Toast in the toaster, butter softening on the counter. The routine was automatic, muscle memory developed over years of performing the role of devoted wife. But today was different. Today, every movement was deliberate, calculated, final. As she set the table, Sydney reached into her purse with steady hands. No trembling now, no fear, just cold determination. Her fingers found the envelope she'd prepared in the middle of the night while Mark slept off his violence like it was just another Tuesday, just another minor incident that would be forgotten by the weekend. Inside that envelope was a single document. Simple, legal, final, a restraining order. She'd called the lawyer at 2 a.m., had explained everything, had sent photos of her face, still swollen and discolored, had authorized the filing. By 6 a.m. it was official. Sydney slid the envelope beneath Mark's plate, white porcelain, part of their wedding china, barely visible, deliberately placed. When Mark walked into the kitchen at 7:15, freshly showered and dressed for work, he barely glanced at her. No apology this morning. No tears. No tender touches or whispered promises. Just a casual sweep of his eyes over her face, a slight smirk tugging at his mouth, and 2 words delivered without emotion. You're up early. Sydney placed the breakfast in front of him with the same care she'd used for 3 years. Perfect eggs, golden brown on the edges. Toast cut diagonally the way he preferred. Coffee exactly the way he liked it, 2 sugars, splash of cream. Enjoy your breakfast, she said, her voice steady and calm. Mark picked up his fork, scanning his phone with his other hand, already mentally at the office, already dismissing her. He had no idea this breakfast was different. He had no idea that beneath his plate sat the beginning of the end he'd been building for years, brick by brick, punch by punch, threat by threat. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching this from? What time is it in your city right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel, how many people connect with the truth that sometimes the quietest acts of courage are the most powerful. And if you're drawn to stories about justice, about women who refuse to stay victims, about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself but simply acts, leave a comment. Tell me what you would do in Sydney's position. Would you see it coming, or would you be as blind as Mark was at that moment, eating breakfast with no idea your entire world was about to shatter? Mark Baker prided himself on control. Not the obvious kind that people whispered about at parties, or that left women running to shelters in the middle of the night. Nothing as crude or unsophisticated as screaming in public or leaving visible bruises where co-workers and family members could see them and ask uncomfortable questions. No, Mark's control was far more refined than that. It was surgical, precise, invisible to everyone except the person being suffocated by it. The kind that wrapped around you so gradually, so gently at first, that you didn't realize you were being strangled until you couldn't breathe anymore, couldn't remember what oxygen felt like, couldn't imagine a life where every breath didn't require permission. He controlled the money first. That's where it always started, subtle and reasonable. Early in their marriage, Mark had suggested combining their finances. "We're a team now," he'd said with that smile that used to make her heart race. "What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine." That's what marriage means. It sounded romantic. Partnership. Unity. Sydney had agreed eagerly, seeing it as a sign of trust and commitment. Within 6 months, her name was removed from their joint account. "Just simpler for taxes," Mark had explained. "I'll handle the finances. You focus on making our house a home." Every dollar Sydney spent after that required explanation, justification, permission. A coffee with a friend became an interrogation. "Why didn't you make coffee at home? Do you know how much we're trying to save? Are you deliberately trying to sabotage our financial goals?" A birthday gift for her sister triggered a lecture about priorities and fiscal responsibility that lasted 3 days. Groceries had to be accounted for down to the penny, receipts scrutinized like evidence in a fraud case. Sydney started asking for money the way a child asks a parent, and Mark gave or withheld based on his assessment of whether she'd earned it through good behavior that week. The joint account Sydney thought she still had access to? Mark had changed the password 2 years ago. She discovered this when she tried to check their balance during an emergency. Her mother had fallen, needed help, and Sydney had wanted to book a last-minute flight. The password didn't work. When she asked Mark about it, he'd sighed like she was being difficult. I changed it for security reasons. You don't need to worry about the accounts, Sydney. That's my job. Just ask me when you need something. The message was clear. She owned nothing, controlled nothing, was entitled to nothing except what he chose to give her. Then came the control over her time. It started reasonably. Text me when you get there, so I know you're safe. Sydney had found it sweet initially, even protective. A man who cared about her well-being. But sweet surveillance became interrogation. Text me when you get there. Text me every hour, and call me every 30 minutes so I can hear what's happening around you. If Sydney was 5 minutes late responding, her phone would explode with messages. Where are you? Why aren't you answering? Who are you with? What are you hiding? If she didn't answer within 3 rings, there were consequences. Nothing violent at first. Just coldness. Withdrawal. The silent treatment that lasted days, that filled the house with tension so thick Sydney could barely breathe, that only ended when she apologized profusely for the crime of being unreachable for 10 minutes. She learned to keep her phone on loud always, charged always, within arm's reach always. She learned to interrupt conversations with friends to answer his calls. She learned to leave gatherings early because Mark had texted that he needed her home. She learned that her time wasn't hers, that her schedule existed only at his pleasure, that making plans without consulting him first was an act of disrespect that would be punished. He controlled what she wore, how she presented herself to the world. At first, it was compliments. You look so beautiful in that dress, but maybe it's a little too revealing? I don't want other guys staring at what's mine. Sydney had changed, flattered that he cared, that he wanted her all to himself. But compliments became criticisms, became commands. That skirt's too short. That neckline's too low. Why are you wearing makeup if you're just going to the grocery store? Who are you trying to impress? Are you trying to make me look like a fool? Are you trying to attract other men? Sydney's wardrobe became a funeral collection. Dark colors, long sleeves, high necklines, loose fits that hid her body, made her invisible, removed her as a sexual being to anyone except Mark. When they went out, he'd inspect her outfit before they left, sometimes making her change 3 or 4 times until she found something that met his approval. The version of Sydney that loved fashion, that enjoyed dressing up, that felt confident in her appearance, that woman disappeared. In her place was someone who dressed like she was trying not to be noticed, not to exist, not to take up space in the world. And when control wasn't enough, when Sydney pushed back even slightly, even in the smallest ways, that's when the violence came. It escalated slowly enough that Sydney couldn't point to a single moment when things changed. A shove during an argument, then a harder shove that sent her into a wall. Then a hand around her throat, not squeezing, just there, just a reminder of how much stronger he was, how vulnerable she was, how easily he could hurt her if he chose to. Then a slap. Then a punch. Then fists that left bruises she had to explain away to concerned co-workers and increasingly distant friends. Mark had a pattern. He'd test boundaries, see how much she'd tolerate, push a little further each time. And after every incident came the apology phase. The flowers. The gifts, the tears and promises. The version of Mark that Sydney had fallen in love with would reappear, tender and loving, making her believe that maybe this time was the last time, that maybe he really would change, that maybe the violence was an aberration rather than the truth of who he'd always been. But that Mark was a mask, a performance, a manipulation tactic designed to keep her trapped in the cycle. Sydney understood that now, as she watched him eat his breakfast, completely unaware of what was about to happen. He chewed slowly, scrolled through his phone, occasionally grunted approval at the eggs. He didn't notice how still she was, how quiet, how her hands, which usually trembled in his presence these days, were perfectly steady as she sipped her coffee and watched him like a scientist observing a dangerous animal behind glass. If stories like this move you, stories about the invisible cages people build around the ones they claim to love, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when those cages finally break open. Because what Mark doesn't know yet, what he can't comprehend as he sits there eating breakfast and planning his day, is that Sydney's been playing a completely different game. And she's already won. "You're not eating," Mark said without looking up from his phone. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. A test. Checking whether she'd comply with the unspoken expectation that they eat together, that she mirrors his routine, that she exists in sync with his desires. Sydney smiled softly, the expression not reaching her eyes. "I ate earlier. Couldn't sleep." Mark nodded, satisfied. That's all it took with him. A simple answer. Compliance. Submission. The right words in the right tone, and he was satisfied, his control confirmed, his dominance unchallenged. He returned to his phone, scrolling through work emails, already mentally out the door. But Sydney wasn't thinking about breakfast anymore. She was thinking about the envelope underneath his plate. The one he still hadn't noticed. The restraining order that had been filed at 6:42 a.m. at the courthouse. The one that meant in approximately 45 minutes, a police officer would arrive to serve him officially. The one that would remove him from this house, from her life, from his position of power. Mark finished his eggs, wiped his mouth with the napkin Sydney had folded perfectly, and stood up. He reached for his plate to put it in the sink, one of his few domestic contributions, done more as a display of what a good husband he was than from any genuine desire to help. As his fingers wrapped around the edge of the plate, they brushed against something underneath. Paper. He paused. Frowned. I pulled out slowly. Sydney watched his face change. Confusion first, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. Then recognition as he read the header. Then realization dawning slowly that this wasn't a bill or a piece of junk mail. This was legal documentation. This was real. This was happening. And then rage, pure, unfiltered fury that turned his face crimson and made the veins in his neck bulge like ropes. What do you think happens when a man who spent years controlling everything suddenly realizes he's controlled nothing at all? When the wife he thought he'd broken turns out to have been gathering strength in secret, planning her escape while serving him breakfast with a smile. Mark's hands shook as he held the restraining order, the paper crinkling in his tightening grip. Not from fear. Mark Baker had never been afraid of anything in his life, least of all consequences. The shaking came from fury. Pure, unfiltered rage that flooded his system like poison, turning his face from red to almost purple, making his breath come in short, sharp bursts like a bull preparing to charge. Sydney remained seated at the kitchen table, her coffee cup raised halfway to her lips, watching him over the rim like she was observing a stranger having a breakdown in public. In a way, she was. This version of Mark, the one stripped of his carefully constructed mask of respectability, the one whose control had been ripped away without warning, was unfamiliar territory. Raw, unfiltered, dangerous in a way that was different from his calculated violence. What the hell is this? His voice was low, deadly quiet. The kind of tone that preceded the worst violence, the kind that made Sydney's survival instinct scream at her to run, to apologize, to de-escalate before his fist found her face again. She'd heard this exact tone dozens of times over their 3 years of marriage. It was the voice he used right before he hurt her. The calm before the storm. The last warning before pain. But this time, something was different. This time, Sydney didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Didn't make herself smaller or prepare her apology or calculate which words might defuse the bomb standing in front of her. Instead, she met his eyes directly, her gaze steady and unflinching. It's exactly what it looks like. Her voice was calm, not defiant. Defiance implied fear underneath, implied she was forcing herself to be brave. This was different. This was acceptance. Finality. The voice of someone who'd already made their decision and wasn't interested in negotiating. Mark's jaw clenched so hard Sydney could hear his teeth grinding. He took a step toward her, his body language screaming threat, violence, retribution. The restraining order crumpled further in his fist, reduced to a ball of paper, as if destroying the document could somehow undo what it represented. Sydney's heart hammered against her ribs, her body's autonomic fear response overriding her mental calm. 3 years of conditioning didn't disappear just because you'd filed paperwork. 3 years of violence had taught her body to recognize the signs of an imminent attack. The way he held his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the darkness in his eyes. Everything in her screamed to run, but she forced herself to remain still. She'd prepared for this moment. I anticipated it. The lawyer had warned her. The most dangerous time for a woman leaving an abusive relationship is right after she makes her move. That's when the abuser realizes he's losing control. That's when desperation overrides calculation. You think you can just, Mark's words caught in his throat, strangled by rage. He was shaking harder now, the paper trembling in his grip, his other hand clenching and unclenching at his side. You think you can do this to me? After everything I've done for you? Everything I've given you? Everything I've sacrificed for this marriage? Sydney set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, the soft clink of porcelain against saucer unnaturally loud in the tension-thick silence. Everything you've done to me, you mean? The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. A truth spoken aloud for the first time in this house, breaking years of silence and pretense. Mark's face twisted into something ugly, something that revealed the rot underneath the handsome exterior. Don't you dare. Don't you dare try to make me the villain here. You know what you did. You know how you pushed me. How you disrespected me. How you made me. What did you do? Sydney interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. Did you hit me? Made you control every aspect of my life? Made you isolate me from everyone who cared about me? No, Mark. You chose that. Every single time, you chose violence. You chose abuse. Don't you dare blame me for your choices. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mark stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like the woman in front of him was a stranger wearing his wife's face. And maybe she was. Maybe the real Sydney, the one who'd existed before he'd systematically broken her down, was finally emerging from the wreckage. You've been planning this, he said slowly, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet again. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation laced with something Sydney hadn't expected to hear, a grudging respect. Not the kind born from love or admiration, but the kind born from recognizing an opponent you'd severely underestimated. Sydney stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. She was still wearing the silk scarf, but she reached up now, with steady hands, and unwound it, letting the soft fabric fall to the table. The bruise was fully visible, deep purple bleeding into black, swollen and angry, marking her face like a brand. I've been surviving, Sydney said quietly, her eyes never leaving him. There's a difference. Mark stared at the bruise he'd put there less than 48 hours ago. For a fleeting moment, something that might have been guilt or shame flickered across his features. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the defensiveness Sydney had seen 100 times before. The inability to accept responsibility. The need to rewrite history, to reframe his violence as something she'd caused, something she'd deserved. That was an accident, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. I told you I was sorry. I promised it wouldn't happen again. You're always sorry, Sydney replied, and her voice carried 3 years of broken promises. Sorry doesn't erase bruises, Mark. It doesn't heal fractured ribs or black eyes or split lips. It doesn't give me back the years I spent walking on eggshells in my own home, afraid to breathe too loud or laugh too hard or exist too fully because I never knew what would set you off next. Mark's hands balled into fists at his sides, and Sydney recognized the stance. This was how it started. The physical manifestation of rage, looking for an outlet, looking for a target. She took an involuntary step back, her body remembering pain even as her mind tried to stay strong. So what? Mark spat, his control slipping further. You're just going to throw away our marriage? Everything we built together? You're going to destroy my reputation, my career, my life, because you couldn't handle a few rough patches. Sydney almost laughed. The sound would have been bitter and broken, so she swallowed it. A few rough patches? Mark, you beat me. Regularly. Systematically. You controlled every dollar I spent, every person I talked to, every minute of my day. You isolated me until I had no one left except you. You made me believe I was crazy, that I deserved the violence, that no one would believe me if I told them the truth. She paused, her voice dropping to something harder. We didn't build anything. You built a cage and convinced me it was a home. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Mark looked at the restraining order again, his brain visibly working through his options, calculating his next move. Sydney could see him trying to figure out how to regain control, how to manipulate his way back in, how to find the angle that would make her doubt herself enough to take it all back. "You know I love you," he said finally, his voice suddenly softer, shifting tactics. The anger drained from his face, replaced by pleading. Vulnerability. The version of Mark that came after violence, the one that begged and promised and made her believe in redemption. "I know I have problems. I know I need help, but we can work on them together. You don't need lawyers and courts and police. We can fix this ourselves. As a couple, as partners." There it was. The apology phase. The manipulation. The attempt to make her responsible for his healing, to frame her escape as abandonment rather than survival. Sydney had heard this exact speech dozens of times. She knew all the beats, all the emotional pressure points he was trying to hit. And for a moment, just a moment, she felt the old familiar pull. The voice in her head that whispered, maybe he really means it this time. Maybe if I just give him one more chance. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe this is what love requires, patience and forgiveness and sacrifice. But then she looked at the bruise in her reflection in the kitchen window. Purple and black and undeniable. And she remembered the feeling of his fist connecting with her face. The taste of blood. The way she'd curled up on the floor while he stood over her, screaming about respect. And she knew with absolute certainty that if she backed down now, if she let him talk his way out of this, she would end up dead. Maybe not today. Maybe not this year. But eventually, inevitably, Mark Baker would kill her. Because men like him didn't stop escalating. They just ran out of victims who would tolerate their violence. "You need to leave, Mark." Her voice was firm, final. Mark blinked, stunned. "What?" "You have 24 hours to vacate the house. It's in the order. If you're still here tomorrow morning, the police will remove you." Mark's face went through a rapid succession of expressions, shock, disbelief, rage, and then finally something cold and calculating that made Sydney's blood run ice. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that was more threatening than shouting. A big one. "You think a piece of paper protects you? You think lawyers and judges can keep you safe from me?" Sydney held his gaze, refusing to let him see the fear coursing through her. "The only mistake I made was staying as long as I did. I should have left the first time you hit me. But I'm leaving now, and you can't stop me." Have you ever watched someone realize they've lost the power they thought they'd always have? Have you ever seen the exact moment control slips through someone's fingers like water, and they absolutely know, it's never coming back? Tell me in the comments what you think Mark does next, because men like him don't accept defeat easily. Mark didn't leave quietly. That wasn't his style. He didn't accept the restraining order with dignity or acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, he destroyed their marriage through his own actions. Instead, he left the way he'd conducted their entire relationship, with noise, chaos, and the desperate thrashing of a man who'd built his entire identity on control and now felt it slipping away like sand through his fingers. He slammed doors hard enough to rattle the frames. Kicked furniture, leaving scuff marks on walls Sydney had painted carefully when they'd first moved in, back when she'd still believed this house could be a home. He shouted threats that echoed through the rooms like thunder, promises that this wasn't over, that she'd regret this, that she had no idea what she'd just started. But despite all the bluster, despite all the rage and intimidation and attempts to make her take it back, Mark left. Because for all his anger, for all his violence, Mark Baker was fundamentally a coward. He was the kind of man who only fought battles he knew he could win, who only showed his true face to people who couldn't fight back effectively. And the restraining order, the legal paperwork, the involvement of courts and lawyers and the justice system, that was a battle he couldn't punch his way through. That required a different kind of fight, one where his physical strength and ability to intimidate meant nothing. Sydney watched from the living room window, hidden partially behind the curtain, as he threw bags into his truck with jerky, aggressive movements. Clothes hastily stuffed into duffel bags without care for wrinkles or organization. His work laptop, his gym equipment, random items grabbed seemingly at random, more about making a show of leaving than actually taking what he needed. He kept looking back at the house, at the window where he must have sensed she was standing. His expressions cycled between rage and disbelief and something that almost looked like hurt, though Sydney knew better than to mistake his wounded pride for genuine emotion. He seemed to expect her to come running out at any moment, to apologize, to take it all back, to beg him not to leave, to promise she'd be better, try harder, stop making him so angry. That's what always happened in the past when she'd threatened to leave. She'd get scared or lonely or convinced by his apologies, and she'd back down, and he'd absolutely know, that he still had power over her. But this time was different. Sydney didn't move from the window, didn't rush out with tears and apologies, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her doubt or waver. When his truck finally pulled out of the driveway, tires squealing slightly as he accelerated too fast, Sydney exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It felt like the first real breath she'd taken in 3 years. Like her lungs had been compressed under the weight of constant fear and hypervigilance and were only now remembering how to expand fully. But she didn't celebrate, didn't pour herself a glass of wine, or call her sister with the good news, or feel the relief she'd imagined would come with this moment. Instead, she felt numb, hollow, like she'd used up all her emotional capacity just getting to this point and had nothing left for processing what came next. She knew this was just the beginning, not the end. Men like Mark didn't go away quietly into the night. They circled like predators who'd lost their prey but couldn't accept the loss. They tested boundaries, looked for weaknesses, probed for any crack in your armor they could exploit to get back in. The lawyer had been explicit about this during their consultations. The restraining order gives you legal protection, she'd said, her expression serious. But paper doesn't stop fists. It doesn't stop someone determined to hurt you. You need to be vigilant, constantly aware of your surroundings. Document everything, every phone call, every text message, every time he drives past the house or shows up at your work. Build a case so comprehensive and solid that when he eventually violates the order, and statistically we can bury him. Sydney had taken that advice seriously, treating it like the survival manual it was. Over the next few days, she moved through her house, making changes that felt both empowering and terrifying. She called a locksmith and had every lock changed, front door, back door, garage, even the deadbolts she'd rarely used. The locksmith was an older woman with kind eyes who took one look at Sydney's barely concealed bruising and said, "Good for you, honey. You need anything else, alarms, reinforced doors, you call me directly." Sydney nodded, grateful for the solidarity, even from a stranger. She installed security cameras, 4 of them, covering every entrance to the house. The front door, the back patio, the side gate, the driveway. They connected to an app on her phone that would alert her to any motion and store footage in the cloud. She spent hours learning how to use the system, adjusting sensitivity settings so it wouldn't trigger every time a squirrel ran across the lawn but would catch any human approaching the property. She made copies of the restraining order, physical copies she could grab quickly, and gave them to her neighbors on both sides. Told them Mark was no longer welcome, that if they saw him anywhere near the property to call police immediately. She gave another copy to her boss at work, explaining the situation in the vague terms of someone still learning how to speak their truth out loud. Her boss had been understanding, had immediately adjusted Sydney's schedule so she worked more remotely, had moved her desk away from the windows, had alerted building security that Mark Baker was not to be allowed in the building under any circumstances. Sydney had cried in the bathroom after that meeting, overwhelmed by the kindness of people who barely knew her but were willing to protect her anyway. If stories like this resonate with you, stories about the hard, unglamorous work of building safety when the system can only do so much, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because Sydney's about to discover that Mark is far more dangerous than she realized, and paper protection means nothing to a man who's decided the rules don't apply to him anymore. She created a safety plan, the kind domestic violence advocates recommend, a bag packed and hidden at her sister's house with clothes, copies of important documents, cash, medications. A code word she could text to Rachel if she needed immediate help but couldn't speak freely. Multiple escape routes mapped out from both her house and her workplace. Numbers programmed into her phone on speed dial. Police, her lawyer, the domestic violence hotline, her therapist. She varied her routes to and from work, never taking the same path 2 days in a row. checked under her car for tracking devices, changed all her passwords on every account, enabled two-factor authentication on everything. It felt paranoid and exhausting and necessary all at once. Like living in a spy movie, except the stakes were her actual life, and there was no director yelling "cut" when the scene got too intense. And Mark didn't disappoint her worst expectations. The text started within hours of him leaving, before his truck had probably even reached wherever he was staying. At first, they were apologetic, pleading, "Baby, please. I'm so sorry. I love you. Let's talk about this. Don't throw away our marriage over one mistake." When she didn't respond, when she followed her lawyer's advice to maintain complete no contact, they turned desperate. "You're ruining everything. We can fix this if you just give me a chance. Don't throw us away. Think about everything we've built together. Remember how good we used to be?" And when desperation failed to elicit a response, they turned ugly, revealing the truth that had always lurked beneath his apologies. "You think you can do this to me? You're nothing without me. I made you. I gave you everything. I can destroy you just as easily. You'll regret this." Sydney saved every single message, screenshot after screenshot, carefully organized in a folder on her phone with timestamps clearly visible. Evidence, ammunition, proof that the man who claimed to love her was really just a man who wanted to own her. The lawyer had been right. Mark couldn't help himself. He had to push. "I had to try to control myself even from a distance." His need for dominance was stronger than his survival instinct. 3 days after the restraining order was served, Sydney was at the grocery store trying to accomplish the mundane task of buying food like a normal person living a normal life. She was in the produce section examining apples when she felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck that meant someone was watching. She looked up and her blood turned to ice. Mark was standing at the end of the aisle, maybe 30 feet away, staring directly at her. Not approaching, not speaking, just watching with that same cold, calculated smile she'd seen 1,000 times before. The smile that said, "I can get to you whenever I want. Your restraining order means nothing." Sydney's hands trembled as they hadn't in days as she reached for her phone in her purse. He wasn't supposed to be within 500 feet of her. It was explicitly stated in the order. Being here in this store at the same time she was shopping was a direct violation. But there he stood, leaning casually against the meat counter, like he had every right to be there, watching her with a predator's patience. What would you do if the person you just escaped showed up in your grocery store, violating a court order, reminding you that you're never really safe? How do you buy apples and milk and bread when your abuser is standing 30 feet away, watching you with a smile? Sydney's first instinct was to run. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to drop the apples, abandon the cart, and get to her car as fast as possible. But running would mean turning her back on Mark, losing sight of him, not knowing if he was following. Running would mean giving him power again, letting him see that he could still control her through fear. So instead, with her heart hammering and her hands shaking badly enough that she had to grip her phone with both hands to steady it, Sydney did exactly what her lawyer had told her to do. She took a photo. Clear, undeniable evidence. The phone's camera captured Mark's face perfectly, his expression shifting from that cold smile to surprise to anger as he realized what she was doing. The grocery store's clock was visible in the frame, timestamped showing the exact date and time. The produce section sign behind him, proving the location. Everything she needed to document a clear violation of the restraining order. Mark's body language changed instantly. He straightened up, his smile vanishing, replaced by an expression of rage barely contained. But Sydney didn't wait to see what he'd do next. She turned away from him, deliberately calm, and walked toward the front of the store. Not running, though everything in her wanted to. Walking with purpose, head up, refusing to look back even though she could feel his eyes burning into her back. She found the store manager first, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 25, whose confusion turned to alarm as Sydney explained quietly that there was a man in the store who was violating a restraining order against her, and could he please stay with her while she called the police? To his credit, the manager didn't ask stupid questions or try to minimize the situation. He immediately radioed for security and stayed beside Sydney as she called 911, her voice remarkably steady considering the adrenaline flooding her system. The operator was professional, efficient. "Stay in a public area. Officers are being dispatched. Do not approach the subject. Stay on the line until police arrive. Sydney stood near the customer service desk, the manager and 2 security guards forming a loose protective circle around her, watching the aisles for any sign of Mark. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. Every person who walked past could have been him. Every sound made Sydney's heart jump. But when police finally arrived, 2 officers, one older male with gray hair and a weathered face, one younger female with sharp, assessing eyes, Sydney felt something close to relief. This was real. This was documented. This was Mark facing consequences for his actions. They asked her to point him out. Sydney led them through the store, half expecting Mark to have vanished, to have slipped away like he always did when accountability loomed. But he hadn't. He was standing exactly where she'd last seen him, leaning against his truck in the parking lot, arms crossed, that same arrogant expression on his face, like he was daring them to do something about it. Like he knew the system was too slow, too lenient, too willing to give men like him second chances and third chances and infinite chances. "That's him," Sydney said quietly, pointing through the glass storefront. "Mark Baker. The restraining order was issued 4 days ago. He's not supposed to be within 500 feet of me." The younger officer nodded, already walking toward the parking lot, her hand resting casually near her weapon. Her partner followed, gesturing for Sydney to stay inside. Through the window, Sydney watched the entire interaction unfold like a silent movie, the officers approaching Mark, showing identification, saying something that made Mark's expression shift from arrogance to annoyance. Mark shook his head, gesturing animatedly, clearly explaining why this was all a misunderstanding, why he had every right to be here, why Sydney was overreacting. But then the older officer held up his phone, showing Mark something, probably the restraining order that had been filed in the system, that came up immediately when they ran his name. Mark's body language changed. He looked toward the store, toward where Sydney stood watching, and the hatred in his eyes was so pure and intense that Sydney took an involuntary step backward even though she was safely inside with glass and distance and witnesses between them. The officer spoke to Mark for another few minutes, what looked like a warning, a clear statement of consequences. Then they walked back toward the store, leaving Mark standing alone by his truck. The female officer came inside, her expression professional, but not unkind. "We've documented the incident, ma'am. He claims he didn't see you, that he shops at this store regularly, and it was just a coincidence. But we've made it clear that coincidence or not, he's in violation of the restraining order and needs to leave immediately." Sydney nodded, knowing that Mark's claim was complete nonsense. He didn't shop at this store. They'd always gone to the one closer to their house. He'd driven 20 minutes out of his way to be here, at the store he knew she preferred. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. "I know where you go. I can find you whenever I want. Your order means nothing. What happens now?" Sydney asked, though she already knew the answer wouldn't satisfy her. The officer sighed, and Sydney heard years of frustration with a broken system in that sound. "We'll file a report documenting the violation. Your lawyer can use this to request a contempt hearing, possibly extend the order or add penalties. If he violates again, especially with this documented incident on record, we can arrest him immediately. If he violates again, not a question of whether, but when." Sydney thanked the officers, collected her things, and left the store without buying anything, her appetite for normalcy thoroughly destroyed. She sat in her car for a long time before driving home, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing exercises her therapist had taught her. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 7, out through the mouth for 8. Again, until her heart rate slowed from panic levels to merely elevated. When she finally made it home, she immediately called her lawyer, sent her the photo, and the police report number, watched as another piece of evidence got added to the growing file that was supposed to protect her. "This is good," her lawyer said, which felt like an insane statement. "Nothing about this felt good." "I know it doesn't feel that way," the lawyer continued, reading Sydney's silence accurately. "But documented violations strengthen our case. If he keeps this up, we can push for jail time. Real jail time, not just overnight." But Sydney wanted more than jail time. She wanted her life back, the life Mark had systematically dismantled piece by piece over 3 years. She wanted her career back, the one she'd walked away from because Mark said her co-workers were too friendly, and her boss was obviously trying to sleep with her, and the late nights were disrespectful to their marriage. She wanted her confidence back. The version of herself who'd existed before Mark had convinced her she was nothing without him. She wanted her friends back, the ones who'd slowly stopped calling after Mark made every gathering awkward with his jealousy and controlling behavior, and barely concealed hostility toward anyone who claimed any of Sydney's time or attention. Most of all, she wanted herself back. The version of Sydney who'd existed before Mark, who laughed without measuring the volume first, who wore what she wanted without considering whether it was too revealing or asking for trouble, who made plans without requiring permission, who had opinions and expressed them without fear of consequences. She wasn't sure that Sydney still existed. Years of systematic abuse had a way of eroding you from the inside out, wearing you down like water over stone, until you were just a shape that resembled your former self but was hollow underneath. Still, she tried. Small steps, careful and deliberate, like someone learning to walk after years of forced immobility. She updated her resume for the first time in 5 years, staring at the gaps in her employment history that screamed red flag to potential employers. How did you explain that you'd left a promising career because your husband demanded it, without making yourself sound weak or damaged or like a liability? She reached out to old friends with hesitant messages that felt like reaching across a chasm. Hey, I know it's been forever, but I'd love to catch up if you're free sometime. Some didn't respond. Friendships don't survive years of neglect and cancellations, and the gradual realization that being friends with Sydney meant dealing with Mark. But some did respond with warmth that made Sydney cry. OMG, yes. I've missed you. Are you okay? We were so worried. She drove past her old favorite coffee shop, the one Mark had forbidden her from visiting because the barista was too friendly and clearly interested in her, and going there was disrespectful to their marriage. This time, she pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, sat there for 5 minutes building up the courage to walk inside. When she finally did, the barista didn't recognize her. It had been 3 years, and Sydney looked different now. Older, harder, like someone who'd survived something. She ordered her old usual, a vanilla latte with extra foam, and sat by the window doing absolutely nothing but existing. No one checked on her location. No one demanded explanations for why she was there, or who she was meeting, or how long she'd be. No one was monitoring her phone to see who she was texting. For 25 minutes, she just existed in public space as an autonomous human being, and it felt both foreign and exhilarating. But even in those moments of hard-won peace, Sydney felt Mark's presence like a shadow. Not literally, he hadn't shown up again after the grocery store incident, at least not that she'd seen. But his presence lingered in every unexpected sound that made her jump, every car that drove past her house just slightly too slowly, every notification on her phone that made her heart race with panic before she could check whether it was him or just a normal text from a normal person in her increasingly less normal life. The texts from unknown numbers started 2 weeks after the grocery store incident. Her lawyer had warned her he'd probably do this. Use different phones or apps to get around the no-contact order, technically violating the spirit of the law while finding loopholes in the letter of it. The messages were short, sporadic, designed to remind her he was still there. Saw you at the coffee shop. You looked happy. Then a few days later, new job? Congratulations. I hope they know what they're getting. Then, you can't hide from me forever. Sydney documented everything, added it all to the file, but felt increasingly hopeless about whether any of it would matter. The system moved so slowly. Court dates were months out. Violations were documented but rarely punished with anything more than warnings and stern talks. And meanwhile, Mark circled like a shark who'd tasted blood and knew, absolutely knew, that eventually he'd find a way back in. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered through regular mail like it was a normal piece of correspondence rather than a veiled threat wrapped in 6 pages of manipulation. Actual handwritten pages, Mark's familiar scrawl covering both sides, rambling and apologetic and accusatory all at once. He wrote about his childhood, his father's temper, framing his violence as trauma he'd inherited rather than choices he'd made. He wrote about work stress and financial pressure and how she didn't understand what he was dealing with. He wrote about love and commitment, and how marriage meant working through problems, not running away at the first sign of difficulty. And then, in the final paragraph, the mask slipped completely. If you don't drop the charges and stop this ridiculous restraining order, you'll regret it. I know things about you too, Sydney. Things that wouldn't look good in court or to your new employer. Don't push me into a corner. You won't like what happens when I have nothing left to lose. Sydney read that line 5 times, her hands perfectly steady now. Something had shifted in her during these weeks of documentation and hypervigilance and small acts of reclaimed autonomy. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her fear had calcified into something harder, colder. She photographed every page of the letter, front and back. Sent copies to her lawyer within 10 minutes. Filed another police report documenting the threat. Added it to the mountain of evidence that proved one undeniable truth. Mark Baker was dangerous, escalating, and had no intention of respecting court orders or her autonomy or anything except his own need for control. What do you do when the person who's supposed to love you threatens to destroy you for trying to save yourself? When does self-preservation stop being selfish and start being the only form of love that matters? Tell me in the comments, because this is the question survivors of abuse face every single day, and the answer is never as simple as people on the outside think it should be. The court date arrived like a storm Sydney had been watching on the horizon for months, inevitable, terrifying, but also strangely welcome, because at least it meant forward movement, meant something was finally happening instead of this endless limbo of waiting and documenting and looking over her shoulder. She woke early that morning, before sunrise, her body's anxiety overriding any possibility of sleep. She'd been awake since 4 a.m., lying in bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything she needed to say, every question the lawyer had prepared her for, every possible scenario that might unfold in that courtroom. She dressed carefully, deliberately, her clothes chosen with the same strategic precision generals use when planning battles. Professional but not provocative, a simple navy blue dress with a modest neckline, hem falling just below her knees. Strong but not aggressive, low heels that made her feel grounded rather than tottering. Her makeup was minimal, just enough to look put together, but not so much that she'd appear vain or frivolous. The bruises had faded now, weeks of healing turning purple and black into yellow-green shadows that she could cover with concealer, though part of her wanted to leave them visible, wanting the judge to see exactly what Mark had done. The lawyer had coached her extensively on courtroom presentation. Judges respond to composure, to credibility, to women who look like victims but don't act like them. I know that's unfair. You shouldn't have to perform a specific version of trauma to be believed. But that's the reality of the system we're working within. Sydney hated that calculation. Hated that even in seeking justice, she had to manage other people's perceptions, had to be the right kind of victim, sympathetic but not hysterical, hurt but not broken, vulnerable but still functional. But she did it anyway because the alternative was losing. And losing meant going back. Losing meant Mark winning. Losing meant everything she'd survived, every risk she'd taken, every terrifying step toward freedom would be for nothing. The courthouse was cold and sterile, all fluorescent lighting, an industrial tile that echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations. Sydney sat on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, her sister Rachel beside her gripping her hand so tightly both their knuckles were white. Across the hallway, maybe 30 feet away, but feeling like 30 miles, Mark sat with his lawyer. He was wearing a suit, expensive, well-tailored, the kind that cost more than Sydney used to make a month back when she was still working. He was clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, looking every inch the respectable professional rather than the man who'd left bruises shaped like his fingers on her arms, who'd kicked down a bathroom door trying to get to her, who'd sent threatening letters promising to destroy her if she didn't comply. When their eyes met across that hallway, Mark smiled. Not a warm smile or an apologetic one. A knowing smile. A smile that said, "You think you can beat me? You think anyone will believe you over me? Look at me. Look at yourself. Who do you think they're going to believe?" Sydney looked away first, hating herself for it even as she did it, her stomach churning with anxiety and doubt. What if he was right? What if the judge didn't believe her? What if Mark's expensive lawyer was better than her court-appointed attorney? What if the system failed her the way it had failed so many women before her, women whose names she knew from news stories, women who'd done everything right and still ended up hurt or dead because paper orders couldn't stop fists? "Stop," Rachel whispered fiercely, squeezing her hand even tighter. "I can see you spiraling. Don't let him get in your head. You've got evidence. You've got documentation. You've got truth on your side. And you've got me and your lawyer and every woman who's ever had to fight this same fight. You've got this, Sid. You've got this." Sydney nodded, trying to absorb her sister's confidence, trying to believe what she was saying even though belief felt like trying to hold water in her bare hands. When they were finally called into the courtroom, Sydney felt like she was moving through water, everything slow and heavy and surreal. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected from watching legal dramas on TV, more cramped and ordinary. The judge was an older woman, maybe early 60s, with sharp gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense expression that revealed exactly nothing about what she was thinking. That felt like it could be a good sign. A woman judge might understand in ways a male judge couldn't. Or maybe that was wishful thinking, Sydney's desperate brain grasping for any sign that this might work out in her favor. Mark's lawyer spoke first, and Sydney immediately hated him. Not just for representing Mark, but for how good he was at it. He was smooth, practiced, his voice carrying just the right mixture of respectful deference to the court and passionate advocacy for his client. He painted Mark as a flawed but fundamentally good man, a loving husband who'd made mistakes under extraordinary stress. He talked about Mark's clean record before this, his stable employment, his contributions to the community, his volunteer work coaching youth soccer. He framed the violence as isolated incidents, unfortunate anomalies rather than patterns, moments of poor judgment rather than systematic abuse. He used words like alleged and misunderstanding, and both parties contributed, spreading blame like butter over bread, diluting Mark's responsibility until it almost disappeared. Sydney's lawyer countered with facts, cold, hard, undeniable evidence. Photographs of bruises in various stages of healing, a visual timeline of violence. Medical records from the emergency room visit Sydney had lied about, claiming she'd fallen downstairs when really Mark had shoved her into a wall hard enough to crack 2 ribs. Text messages where Mark threatened her, promised to make her sorry, called her names that made Sydney flinch even reading them again in the formal courtroom setting. Witness statements from friends and family who'd seen the control, the isolation, the gradual erasure of who Sydney used to be. The letter with its thinly veiled threats about destroying her if she didn't drop the charges. 6 months of meticulously documented abuse compiled into an undeniable narrative that said, "This man is dangerous." The judge listened without interruption, her face revealing absolutely nothing. When both lawyers finished their presentations, she leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, and cleaned them slowly with a cloth from her desk, a gesture that felt deliberate, a moment to think before speaking. Then she replaced her glasses and looked directly at Sydney. "Ms. Baker, please approach the stand." Sydney's legs felt weak and unsteady as she walked to the witness stand, hyper-aware of every eye in the courtroom watching her. She was sworn in, her hand on the Bible, and then the judge asked the question Sydney had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. "Ms. Baker, in your own words, not what your lawyer told you to say, not what you think I want to hear, but in your own words, tell me why you're here today. Tell me your story." If you want to see what happens when truth finally speaks louder than manipulation, when a woman's voice cuts through years of silencing and gaslighting and being told her reality isn't real, subscribe now. Because what Sydney says next changes the entire trajectory of this case and proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against abuse isn't physical strength or legal expertise, but simply the courage to speak truth out loud in a room where people are finally listening. Sydney took a breath, deep, steadying, drawing strength from some reserve she hadn't known she possessed. She looked at Mark briefly, then back at the judge, and she started talking. Not a performance carefully crafted to elicit sympathy. Not a calculated version of her trauma designed to hit specific emotional beats. Just the raw, ugly, honest truth that had been trapped inside her for 3 years, finally finding air and light and witness. She talked about the first time Mark hit her, 3 months into their marriage, how he'd apologized so profusely and seemed so genuinely devastated by what he'd done that she believed it was a one-time thing, an aberration, something that would never happen again. She talked about how the violence escalated gradually, methodically, like a frog in slowly boiling water that doesn't realize it's being cooked until it's too late. She talked about the isolation, how Mark had systematically cut her off from friends and family, making every relationship outside their marriage feel like a betrayal, until she was completely alone with only him. She talked about the control over money, over her time, over what she wore, and where she went and who she talked to. She talked about the fear that had become her constant companion, living in her bones, making her hyper-vigilant and anxious and unable to relax even in her own home. She talked about the morning she served him that final breakfast, the restraining order hidden beneath his plate like a landmine he didn't see coming. She talked about making that decision, the moment she realized her life was worth more than his promises, that survival meant leaving, that staying would eventually mean dying. Her voice didn't break as she spoke. She didn't cry, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. She simply spoke truth, and in that courtroom, her words carried the weight of years of silence finally, devastatingly shattered. When she finished, the courtroom was completely silent. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression still unreadable, but something shifting in her eyes, recognition maybe, or solidarity, or simply the acknowledgement that she'd heard and believed. She looked at Mark, then back at Sydney, and then she made her ruling. "What do you think?" she said. "Do you believe in a system that protects women, or have you seen too much evidence to the contrary? Have you watched justice fail enough times that hope feels naive? Tell me in the comments, because Sydney's about to find out whether the truth she spoke was enough." "Mr. Baker," the judge said, her voice cutting through the courtroom silence like a blade through silk, sharp, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "I've presided over many cases like this during my 23 years on the bench. Too many. Far too many. And I've seen every excuse, every justification, every attempt to minimize abuse and shift responsibility from perpetrator to victim. I've heard men claim their wives provoked them, that stress made them do it, that it wasn't as bad as it looked, that everyone deserves a second chance." She paused, her gray eyes fixed on Mark with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "What I see here is not a misunderstanding. It's not mutual combat. It's not a rough patch in an otherwise healthy marriage. It's a clear, well-documented pattern of systematic abuse." Mark's jaw tightened, his lawyer's hand moving to his arm in a subtle warning to stay calm, to not react, to let the process play out. The judge continued, flipping through the thick file in front of her with deliberate slowness, each page representing another piece of Sydney's suffering transformed into evidence. The documentation presented by Ms. Baker is extensive and credible. Photographs showing injuries in various stages of healing, proving this wasn't isolated. Medical records corroborating her account. Text messages containing explicit threats. Witness testimonies from multiple people describing behavioral patterns consistent with coercive control. Security footage showing you fleeing Ms. Baker's residence after breaking in. A handwritten letter from you containing what can only be described as thinly veiled threats. She looked up from a file, directly at Mark again. "This isn't a he said she said situation where I have to guess who's telling the truth. This is a clear case of domestic violence, stalking, harassment, and violation of a protective order. The evidence is overwhelming." Sydney felt Rachel squeeze her hand under the table, felt something in her chest that might have been hope starting to unfold like a flower that had been closed for years. "The restraining order is hereby extended for 2 years, the judge continued, her voice formal now, official, the weight of legal authority behind every word. "Mr. Baker, you are prohibited from contacting Ms. Baker directly or indirectly. That means no phone calls, no text messages, no emails, no letters, no communication through third parties, no social media contact, no showing up at places you know she frequents. You are to stay at least 1,000 feet away from her residence, her workplace, and any location she regularly visits. If you're unsure whether you're in violation, the answer is stay away." Mark's face turned red, a flush creeping up his neck that Sydney recognized as barely contained rage. But he stayed silent, his lawyer's hand still on his arm, both of them knowing that an outburst right now would only make things worse. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, given your violation of the initial restraining order, showing up at the grocery store where Ms. Baker was shopping, and the threatening letter you sent despite the no-contact provision, I'm ordering mandatory anger management counseling. 52 weeks, 1 session per week, with a certified domestic violence counselor. You will also undergo psychiatric evaluation to assess risk factors and treatment needs. She paused, letting that sink in, then added the part that made Sydney's breath catch. Failure to comply with any provision of this order, the distance requirements, the no-contact provisions, or the mandatory counseling, will result in immediate arrest and incarceration. Not a warning, not a discussion. Immediate arrest. Do you understand, Mr. Baker? Mark's voice was tight when he responded, "Yes, Your Honor." Sydney exhaled, a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months. It wasn't everything. She'd hoped for jail time, for something that felt like real punishment rather than just restrictions and requirements. But it was something. It was protection. It was validation from someone with authority that she wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't making a big deal out of nothing. It was an official recognition that what had happened to her was real, serious, and criminal. As they left the courtroom, Sydney kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at Mark even though she could feel his stare burning into her back. Rachel kept pace beside her, one arm around her shoulders, forming a physical barrier between Sydney and any potential threat. In the hallway outside, Sydney's lawyer caught up with them, her expression cautiously optimistic. That was a good ruling. Strong provisions, serious consequences for violation. Judge Morrison doesn't mess around with domestic violence cases. Sydney nodded, trying to absorb the victory, but something cold was settling in her stomach. Because she'd seen Mark's face during the ruling. The rage simmered beneath his forced composure. The way his fists had clenched and unclenched rhythmically, a physical manifestation of violence barely contained. The way he'd stared at her as she walked past him in the hallway, his eyes promising that this wasn't over, that legal rulings didn't erase hate or obsession, that they just delayed the inevitable. That night, Sydney couldn't sleep. She lay in bed in her sister's guest room. She'd been staying with Rachel for the past week, finding her own house too isolating and vulnerable despite the security system, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound. The house is settling. The wind outside. A car driving past. Her nervous system was stuck in threat detection mode, her body unable to accept that she was safe even temporarily. Every sound could be him. Every shadow could be a threat. Days passed, then weeks, and Mark stayed away. At least physically. He didn't show up at her work or her house or the places she frequented. The lawyer said he was attending the mandated counseling, checking in with his probation officer, maintaining the required distance. On paper, he was complying perfectly. But Sydney didn't feel safe. Safety wasn't something you could legislate or enforce with court orders. It was a feeling, a bone-deep certainty that you weren't in danger, and Mark had stolen that from her years ago. Sydney felt his presence everywhere despite his physical absence. In the car that seemed to follow her home from work before turning down a different street. In the unknown number that called and immediately hung up when she answered. In the gut feeling, impossible to prove but impossible to ignore, that she was being watched even when she couldn't see anyone. Her lawyer called it hypervigilance, a symptom of PTSD. Your nervous system is stuck in survival mode, she explained during one of their check-in calls. It's been conditioned by years of unpredictable violence to see threats everywhere. It'll take time to recalibrate, to learn that you're actually safe now. But was she actually safe? Sydney wasn't convinced. She knew Mark in ways the court system never could. Knew his patterns, his obsessions, his inability to accept anything he perceived as defeat or loss of control. Men like him didn't comply with court orders out of respect for the law. They complied when it served their purposes, when the cost of violation outweighed the benefit. And Sydney could feel him out there, circling, waiting, biding his time until he found an angle the restraining order didn't cover. Still, she tried to move forward, to build something resembling a normal life. She got the job she'd applied for at the marketing firm, starting as a junior account coordinator, a step down from where her career had been before Mark, but a step forward from a nowhere she'd been stuck in for 3 years. Her first day was terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with Mark. sitting in meetings, contributing ideas, being treated like a person with value and expertise rather than an object to be controlled. It felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes that didn't quite fit. Her co-workers were kind, professionally friendly, in that way office environments cultivate. They didn't know her story, didn't know she was rebuilding a life from rubble, didn't know that every normal interaction felt like relearning a language she'd once been fluent in. Sydney wanted it that way, wanted to be known for her work and her ideas rather than her trauma, wanted to be Sydney the marketing professional rather than Sydney the abuse victim. But one woman seemed to see through the facade. Lisa, the senior manager who'd interviewed her, pulled Sydney aside after a particularly stressful client meeting during her second week. "Hey," Lisa said quietly, away from the others. "I don't know your situation and you don't have to tell me. But I recognize the signs, the way you scan rooms, the hypervigilance, the way you apologize for taking up space. I've been there. Different details, same pattern." She handed Sydney a business card for a therapist. "This woman specializes in trauma recovery. She helped me. And if you ever need anything, someone to call, someone to walk you to your car, someone who understands without needing explanation, I'm here." Sydney nodded, throat tight with unexpected emotion, unable to speak without crying. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions, wasn't used to people offering help without expecting something in return. It made her realize how isolated she'd become, how much she'd normalized Mark's version of a relationship where love meant control and care meant surveillance. Real support looked nothing like what she'd been living with. What does genuine support look like when you've been conditioned to see control as care? How do you learn to trust again when trust has been systematically weaponized against you for years? Tell me in the comments, because survivors need to know they're not alone in struggling with these questions, that healing isn't linear, that some days you feel strong, and some days you feel like you're right back where you started. 3 months after the court ruling, Sydney was finally starting to breathe in a way that felt almost normal. The hypervigilance hadn't disappeared. She still checked her rearview mirror obsessively, still scanned parking lots before getting out of her car, still slept with her phone on the nightstand and pepper spray in the drawer. But the constant adrenaline had dulled to something more manageable. She could go hours now without thinking about Mark, without jumping at unexpected sounds, without that crushing weight of fear that had defined her existence for so long. Her life was beginning to resemble something that looked like normalcy from the outside. She'd moved back into her own house after reinforcing security, better cameras, stronger locks, a monitored alarm system that connected directly to police dispatch. She'd reconnected with old friends, cautiously at first, testing whether those relationships could be salvaged after years of neglect and cancellations and Mark's interference. Most welcomed her back without judgment, understanding in the way people who've never experienced abuse can't quite fully grasp, but try their best to support anyway. She'd started therapy, real, intensive trauma therapy with the woman Lisa had recommended. Dr. Chen specialized in complex PTSD and didn't flinch at anything Sydney described. She helped Sydney understand that her nervous system's threat responses weren't character flaws or signs she was broken beyond repair, but normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. That healing meant building new neural pathways, teaching her brain that the danger had passed, that she could relax without risking her safety. Sydney had even started dating again, though dating felt like too strong a word for the careful, boundaried interactions she allowed. Coffee meetings in public places. Conversations where she was hyper-aware of any signs of controlling behavior, asking too many questions about her schedule, showing up unexpectedly, moving too fast emotionally, expecting access to her phone or social media. Red flags she'd missed or minimized with Mark now glowed like neon warning signs. She'd learned to trust her gut, to walk away at the first sign of discomfort, to believe that being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who made her feel unsafe. Work had become a refuge, a place where she could focus on problems that had solutions, where her competence and intelligence were valued, where she was rebuilding professional identity that Mark had systematically dismantled. She'd been promoted after just 2 months, Lisa advocating for her, recognizing talent that had been dormant but not destroyed. The extra money meant financial independence, meant not having to worry about whether she could afford her mortgage, and her therapy co-pays, and the security system monitoring fees all in the same month. But normalcy, Sydney was learning, is fragile when it's built on the ruins of trauma. And Mark was nothing if not patient when patience served his purposes. He'd complied with the restraining order perfectly on paper, no documented violations, attendance at all mandated counseling sessions, regular check-ins with his probation officer. To the court system, he looked like a model of rehabilitation. But Sydney knew better. She knew Mark didn't change. He adapted. He strategized. He waited for the perfect moment to strike. The first sign was so subtle Sydney almost missed it. She came home from work one evening to find her mailbox open, not broken or damaged, just open, like someone had checked it and not quite closed it all the way. Nothing was missing from inside. The bills and catalogs were all there. But they were slightly out of order, disturbed in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Sydney told herself she was being paranoid, that the mail carrier had been careless, that she was seeing threats where none existed. But she photographed it anyway, documenting the small wrongness, adding it to her running log of things that didn't quite feel right. 2 days later, her car alarm went off at 3:47 a.m., jerking her from sleep with her heart immediately hammering in panic mode. She grabbed her phone, pulled up the security camera app with shaking hands, scanned every angle around her house and car. Nothing. No one was visible near her car. No obvious reason for the alarm to trigger. A malfunction probably, or an animal, or sensitivity settings that needed adjustment. She reset the alarm remotely and tried to go back to sleep, but couldn't, lying awake until sunrise watching the camera feed for any sign of movement. For days after that, she found flowers on her doorstep. Beautiful roses, a dozen of them, the expensive kind from an actual florist, rather than a grocery store bouquet. Red roses, wrapped in cellophane with a white ribbon, no card, no note, no indication of who'd left them. Just flowers, sitting there on her welcome mat when she opened the door to leave for work. Innocent to anyone else. Menacing to Sydney, who remembered that Mark used to bring her red roses after particularly bad fights, who understood these flowers as a message. I can still reach you. I know where you live. Your security cameras and court orders can't stop me. Sydney's hands trembled as she photographed the flowers from multiple angles before calling the police. She checked her security footage, rewinding through hours of recording, looking for when they'd been delivered. The cameras showed nothing. Whoever left them had known exactly where the blind spots were, had approached from an angle that avoided all camera coverage, had placed the flowers and left without ever appearing on screen. The responding officers were sympathetic, but limited in what they could do. Could be from a secret admirer, one suggested, clearly trying to be helpful. Or could be from the ex-husband violating his restraining order, but without proof. Sydney didn't bother explaining that the flowers felt less like admiration and more like a stalker marking territory, a predator letting prey know they're being hunted. She just thanked the officers, filed a report, and called her lawyer. He's testing boundaries, her lawyer said, voice grim with recognition. Seeing what he can get away with, how close he can get without triggering consequences. Classic pattern with these cases. Keep documenting everything meticulously. We need concrete proof of violation, preferably with him visible on camera or witnesses who can identify him. But proof remained elusive over the following weeks. Mark was being extremely careful, operating in shadows and blind spots, engaging in a campaign of psychological warfare designed to make Sydney feel unsafe without giving her evidence solid enough to act on. Her social media accounts were hacked, nothing posted, nothing deleted, nothing overtly vandalized, but her passwords suddenly didn't work. She reset them, enabled two-factor authentication, but the violation remained. Someone had been inside her digital life, reading her messages, seeing her photos, knowing her business. She started noticing the same car parked on her street at odd times. Different days, different times, but the same silver sedan. She wrote down the license plate, called the police, and filed another report. They ran the plate, rental car from a national chain. Dead end. Could be anyone. Could be Mark renting cars under different names. Could be a complete coincidence. No way to prove anything. Sydney felt like she was slowly losing her mind. Trapped in a nightmare where every strange occurrence could be explained away as paranoia or coincidence or trauma-induced hypervigilance. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe her therapist was right that PTSD was making her see threats that weren't really there. Maybe Mark had actually moved on, and these were just random coincidences, and she was the crazy one creating connections that didn't exist. But then one night he stopped being subtle. Sydney woke to the sound of breaking glass, her bedroom window shattering inward, shards exploding across her floor. She grabbed her phone with one hand, pepper spray with the other, and ran for the bathroom, the only room with a lock that might hold for a few minutes. She dialed 911 with shaking fingers, her voice somehow steady as she told the operator, "Someone's breaking into my house. I have a restraining order against my ex-husband. I think it's him." Through the phone, she heard the operator's calm, professional voice. "Officers are being dispatched to your location. Stay where you are. Keep the door locked. Don't hang up. Stay on the line with me." Sydney crouched in the bathtub, the safest spot, below the window line, away from the door, pepper spray in one hand, phone pressed to her ear with the other. She heard footsteps in her house. Heavy boots on hardwood flooring. Slow, deliberate steps, unhurried, like someone who had all the time in the world. And then she heard his voice, the one that still haunted her nightmares even 3 months later. "Sydney, I just want to talk. Come out and talk to me." His voice was calm, reasonable, like he was asking her to discuss dinner plans rather than hunting her in her own home after breaking in through her window in the middle of the night. That calm terrified Sydney more than if he'd been shouting. Calm Mark was calculating Mark. Calm Mark was the version that planned his violence, that had thought this through, that had decided the consequences were worth it. What would you do, trapped in your own bathroom at 4 a.m, with the person who swore to love you now hunting you like prey? Where does survival instinct take over when fear threatens to paralyze every muscle? How do you make your body move when your brain is screaming contradictory commands to run and hide and fight and freeze all at once? "Sydney, come out. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Mark's voice drifted through the bathroom door, still maintaining that eerie calm that made Sydney's skin crawl. She pressed herself harder against the bathtub's cold porcelain, making herself as small as possible, phone still pressed to her ear. The 911 operator's voice continued providing steady reassurance. "Officers are 2 minutes away. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Do not engage with him under any circumstances. Help is almost there." But 2 minutes felt like 2 hours when you were trapped with someone who'd already proven he was willing to hurt you, who'd broken through your window and into your home like locks and alarms and court orders meant nothing. Sydney's entire body was shaking, adrenaline flooding her system in waves, her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The pepper spray in her hand suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. What was made against a man Mark's size, especially if she couldn't deploy it effectively in the small bathroom space? Mark knew this house intimately. He'd lived here for 2 years of their marriage before she'd finally gotten him removed. He knew every room, every corner, every lock, every weakness in its construction. He knew the bathroom door was hollow core, cheap, the kind installed in tract homes to save money. The kind that could be kicked in with 1 or 2 solid hits from someone who weighed 200 pounds and worked out religiously. Sydney's eyes darted to the small window above the toilet, too small for her to fit through, maybe 10 inches wide. No escape route. No way out except through Mark. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Mark continued, his voice closer now. Right outside the bathroom door based on the sound. Sydney bit down on her fist to keep from making noise, tears streaming silently down her face. "The therapist they made me see. She asked me a lot of questions. About anger, about control, about what I learned from my parents about relationships. And you know what I realized?" He paused like he expected her to respond. When she didn't, he continued anyway. "I realized that you're the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't in control. And I hated that feeling. I still hate it." The doorknob rattled, testing whether it was locked. Sydney's breath caught. "The therapist says that's my core issue, needing control because I'm afraid of abandonment. Isn't that interesting? All this time I thought I was just protecting what was mine, protecting our marriage. But apparently it's deeper than that. Psychological, rooted in childhood trauma." His tone was almost conversational, like he was sharing interesting facts from a documentary rather than terrorizing his ex-wife while breaking multiple laws. The doorknob stopped rattling. Silence for 5 seconds. 10. 15. The silence was somehow worse than the talking, because Sydney couldn't tell where he was or what he was doing. Then came the sound she'd been dreading, a heavy thud against the door. He was kicking it. testing its strength, just like she'd known he would. The door shuddered but held. "The thing is," Mark said, his voice still eerily calm despite the violence of his actions, "the therapist says I need closure to move forward. Says I can't heal until I process what happened between us, until I get to say my piece without lawyers and judges interrupting. So I thought, why not ask Sydney directly? Let's have a real conversation. No court system. No restraining orders. Just us, like it used to be." Another kick, harder this time. The door cracked audibly, with splintering around the lock mechanism. Sydney stood from the bathtub on legs that barely held her weight, backed into the corner, raised the pepper spray with both hands to keep it steady. If he broke through, she'd aim for his eyes. She'd spray until the canister was empty. And then she'd fight with everything she had: nails, teeth, knees, elbows, every self-defense technique she'd learned in the class she'd taken after filing the restraining order. The operator's voice in her ear, 30 seconds. Officers are 30 seconds away. I can hear them on the radio. Hold on. 30 seconds might as well be 30 minutes when a door was splintering inward. Mark kicked again, and this time the frame gave way partially, the door bowing inward but not completely breaking. One more kick would do it. Sydney could see his shadow under the door gap, could hear his breathing, heavy and labored now from the exertion. "Sydney," Mark said, his voice finally losing some of that artificial calm, anger bleeding through. "You ruined my life. You understand that, right? The restraining order, the arrest, the criminal record. Everyone at work knows now. They did a background check after the arrest came up in a client meeting. My family thinks I'm a monster. My friends stop returning calls. My own mother won't talk to me. You did all of this." The door splintered further with another kick, breaking inward enough that Sydney could see part of Mark's face through the gap, one eye visible, wild and furious. "So I figured," he continued, his voice rising now, control slipping, "if my life is over anyway, if there's nothing left to lose, why should yours get to continue? Why should you get to move on and be happy and have a career and friends and a future when you took all of that from me?" That's when Sydney heard the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard in her entire life: sirens. Distant but getting rapidly closer, multiple vehicles based on the overlapping wails. Mark heard them too. The shadow under the door stilled. His eye, visible through the crack, widened slightly. For a moment, nothing. And then footsteps, rapid and retreating. He was running. Sydney didn't move, didn't unlock the door, didn't breathe. The operator's voice: "Officers are entering your property now. They're coming through the front door. You're safe. Stay where you are. They'll come to you. Just stay on the line with me." 30 seconds later, maybe 40, Sydney heard different voices. Male authoritative, commanding. "Police. Let me see your hands. Get on the ground now. Hands where we can see them." Rapid footsteps throughout the house, multiple officers based on the different voices, calling out clear as they searched each room. And then a firm knock on the bathroom door, different from Mark's testing rattle. "Mom? Sydney Baker? This is the police. Are you in there? You're safe now. It's safe to open the door." Sydney's legs gave out completely. She slid down the wall, still clutching the pepper spray, and started sobbing. Not from relief exactly, though relief was part of it. More from the sheer exhaustion of surviving, again and again, from the weight of months of fear and hypervigilance, and constantly looking over her shoulder, finally crashing down on her all at once. She couldn't stand it. Couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Just sobbed, great heaving gasps that hurt her chest and made her whole body shake. When she finally managed to unlock and open the door several minutes later, 2 officers stood there, a male and female, both young, probably in their early 30s, their expressions mixing professional composure with genuine concern. "He ran out the back door," the male officer explained, gesturing toward the rear of the house. "We have units in pursuit. They'll get him. He won't get far." The female officer crouched down to Sydney's level where she sat on the bathroom floor, unable to stand. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you? Do you need medical attention?" Sydney shook her head, finding her voice. "No, I locked myself in here. He was trying to break down the door when you arrived. He didn't get to me." The officer nodded, her eyes kind. "That was smart thinking. You did everything right. You called 911 immediately. You secured yourself in a room with a lock. You stayed on the line. You saved yourself tonight." Sydney wasn't sure about that. She'd survived, yes. But save implied some level of control or agency that she didn't feel she'd possessed. She just reacted on instinct and gotten lucky that police response time was fast enough. 5 more minutes, and Mark would have broken through. 5 more minutes, and she'd be telling a very different story. Or not telling any story at all. Mark Baker was arrested 4 blocks away, hiding in someone's backyard shed like the coward he fundamentally was. He didn't resist this time, didn't fight, didn't run further once they found him. He just stood there, hands raised, as if he'd known all along this was how it would end. But his eyes, even in defeat, even in handcuffs, held that same cold calculation Sydney recognized. He wasn't done. He just paused. And that terrified her more than anything. What does victory look like when you're too broken and exhausted to celebrate it? When does survival stop feeling like enough and start feeling like something you can actually build a future on? Tell me in the comments, because survivors need to hear that it's okay to not feel triumphant, that sometimes the best you can do is just keep breathing. Mark Baker was arrested 4 blocks from Sydney's house, found hiding in someone's backyard shed behind lawn equipment and paint cans, his expensive suit dirty, and torn from climbing fences. He didn't resist when they pulled him out. Didn't fight. Didn't run. He just stood there with his hands raised, breathing hard, staring at the officers with an expression that cycled between rage and resignation. This time there was no bail. The charges stacked up like bricks building a prison wall. Breaking and entering. Violation of a restraining order, second offense. Stalking. Attempted assault. Criminal trespassing. The prosecutor called Sydney 2 days after Mark's arrest, her voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine concern. We're pursuing maximum sentencing on all charges. His pattern of escalation, the documented violations, the break-in while you were home, it paints a clear picture of someone who's dangerous and won't stop. But we'll need your testimony. We'll need you to testify in court about everything. Sydney had expected this request, had dreaded it since the moment she'd heard Mark being arrested. The thought of standing in a courtroom, reliving the worst moments of her life in front of strangers while Mark sat there watching, while his lawyer tried to tear apart her credibility and make her look like a vindictive ex-wife rather than a victim, it made her physically ill. But she agreed anyway, because the alternative was letting him potentially get away with minimal consequences. The alternative was him hurting someone else the way he'd hurt her. The alternative was living the rest of her life knowing she'd had a chance to stop him and had been too afraid. The trial took 3 weeks from start to finish. Sydney testified for 2 days, the longest 2 days of her life. She walked the jury through years of abuse, piece by methodical piece, bruise by documented bruise. She showed them photographs that made several jurors visibly wince, images of her face swollen and discolored, her arms marked with finger-shaped bruises, her ribs wrapped after Mark had cracked 2 of them. She read them text messages where Mark threatened to destroy her if she didn't comply, where he called her worthless and stupid and said no one would ever believe her. She described in excruciating detail the night he'd broken into her house, the sound of shattering glass, the feeling of being trapped in her bathroom while he kicked at the door, the certainty that she was going to die in her own home at the hands of someone who'd promised to love her forever. Mark's lawyer tried valiantly to paint Sydney as vindictive, as someone who'd fabricated or exaggerated evidence to destroy a good man's life out of spite after a bad breakup. He pointed out that she'd stayed in the marriage for 3 years, implying that if the abuse was really as bad as she claimed, she would have left sooner. He suggested she was mentally unstable, using her PTSD diagnosis as evidence of unreliability rather than consequence of trauma. He tried to introduce evidence of her own bad behavior, times she'd yelled back during arguments, a speeding ticket from 2 years ago, anything to muddy the waters and suggest mutual toxicity rather than one-sided abuse. But the evidence against Mark was too overwhelming, too well documented, too consistent across multiple sources. The medical records that corroborated her injuries, the police reports from multiple incidents, the testimonies from friends and family who'd witnessed Mark's controlling behavior and Sydney's gradual isolation. The security footage shows Mark running from Sydney's house the night of the break-in, his image time-stamped and crystal clear. The documented pattern of restraining order violations. The threatening letter in his own handwriting. the neighbors who'd heard Sydney screaming, and Mark shouting through the walls. The co-worker who'd seen Sydney's bruises had tried to hide and had filed a report with HR out of concern. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. We find the defendant, Mark Anthony Baker, guilty on all counts. Sydney cried when the verdict was read. Not tears of joy or relief exactly, though both of those emotions were present. Mostly she cried from release. Years of fear, of hypervigilance, of constantly looking over her shoulder, of wondering if anyone would ever believe her, of carrying the weight of survival entirely alone. It all poured out in that moment, her sister holding her while her shoulders shook with sobs that felt like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. Mark's face remained impassive as the verdict was read, but Sydney saw his hands clench into fists under the table, saw the muscle in his jaw twitching, saw the rage he was barely containing. Even now, even facing prison, even having lost completely, he couldn't accept that she'd beaten him, that she'd been stronger than his violence, that she'd survived him. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge, the same woman who'd extended the restraining order, looked at Mark with obvious disgust. Mr. Baker, you had multiple opportunities to change your behavior. You were given a restraining order with clear boundaries. You were mandated to attend counseling. You were warned explicitly about consequences for violations. And at every turn, you chose to escalate. You chose to terrorize a woman whose only crime was trying to protect herself from your violence. She sentenced him to 6 years in prison, consecutive sentences on multiple charges, no possibility of early release. It wasn't enough. 6 years would never be enough to compensate for what Mark had taken from Sydney, for the years of fear and pain and damage that would take decades to fully heal. But it was time. Time for Sydney to rebuild without constantly checking for his shadow. Time to remember who she'd been before he'd systematically dismantled her. Time to learn how to live without fear as her constant companion. The months after the sentencing were strange and disorienting in ways Sydney hadn't anticipated. She'd spent so long in survival mode, hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats, every bit of mental energy devoted to staying safe, that she didn't know how to function without it. Her therapist explained that her nervous system had been reprogrammed by trauma, that healing would require patience and deliberate practice in teaching her brain that the danger had passed, that she could relax without risking her safety. Sydney threw herself into therapy, twice-a-week sessions where she processed not just the abuse, but the complicated grief of losing years of her life, the shame that still surfaced despite knowing intellectually that none of it was her fault, the anger that had been suppressed for so long because being angry with Mark while living with him was dangerous. She learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days she felt strong and capable and proud of herself for surviving, and other days the smallest trigger. A man who walked like Mark, the scent of the cologne he used to wear, the sound of breaking glass, would send her spiraling back to that bathroom, clutching pepper spray, certain she was going to die. But slowly, incrementally, she rebuilt. Her career flourished in ways it never could have while she was with Mark. She was promoted twice in 18 months, eventually becoming a senior account manager. Her confidence returned gradually, piece by piece. The ability to speak up in meetings, to advocate for her ideas, to take up space without apologizing for existing. She reconnected with old parts of herself she'd thought were gone forever. The version who loved hiking and had abandoned it because Mark said it was dangerous to go alone. The version who dressed in colors besides black and gray. The version who laughed freely without calculating whether it was too loud or drew too much attention. She dated eventually, though carefully, and with firm boundaries that the previous version of herself would never have established. She learned to recognize red flags early, the guy who texted too frequently and got upset when she didn't respond immediately, the one who made jokes about her needing his permission, even though he claimed he was kidding, the one who wanted to know her schedule in detail under the guise of planning dates. She walked away from all of them without guilt, understanding finally and completely that being alone was infinitely better than being with someone who made her feel unsafe or controlled or less than fully human. 6 years passed faster than Sydney expected. She'd built an entire life in that time, a life that was wholly hers, untouched by Mark's influence. She had a career she loved, friends who knew her story and supported her without trying to fix her, a therapist who'd helped her understand that surviving abuse wasn't something to be ashamed of, but rather evidence of extraordinary strength. She dated, had a few relationships that didn't work out for normal reasons rather than abusive ones, and had learned what a healthy partnership actually looked like. When Mark became eligible for parole after serving his minimum sentence, Sydney showed up to the hearing. She'd prepared a victim impact statement, had rehearsed it with her therapist until she could deliver it without her voice shaking. Not because she needed Mark to hear it, she had no illusions that he'd suddenly develop empathy or understanding. But because the parole board needed to understand the full scope of what he'd done, the impact extended far beyond physical bruises that had long since healed. Mark looked different. Older, grayer, smaller somehow, in his prison jumpsuit. Diminished. He avoided her eyes as she spoke, staring at the table in front of him while she detailed how his abuse had affected every aspect of her life. The PTSD that still flared up years later. The way she'd had to completely rebuild her sense of self from nothing. The financial cost of years of therapy. The relationships that had been damaged or destroyed. The career opportunities lost. The time she'd never get back. When she finished, the parole board asked Mark if he wanted to respond. He stood slowly, cleared his throat, and said in a flat, rehearsed tone, "I'm sorry for what I did. I've spent 6 years thinking about my actions, working with prison counselors, attending every program available. I'm not the same person who committed those crimes. I've changed. I understand now how wrong I was." The words were right, exactly what a parole board wants to hear from someone seeking release. But Sydney watched his face as he spoke, searching for any sign of genuine remorse or transformation. She didn't find it. She saw the same Mark, just older and more practiced at saying what people wanted to hear. The apology sounded exactly like the dozens of apologies she'd heard during their marriage, empty words deployed strategically to achieve a goal rather than expressing genuine understanding or change. The parole board deliberated for 20 minutes before delivering their decision. Parole denied. He'd have to serve his full sentence. As Sydney left the building, she realized something profound. She didn't feel satisfaction or vindication or the sense of victory she'd thought this moment would bring. She just felt done. Mark Baker no longer occupied the central space in her mind that he'd consumed for years. He was a chapter in her story, an important one that had shaped her in significant ways, but just a chapter. Not the whole book. Not even close. Driving home that day, windows down, music playing, Sydney found herself smiling. Not because Mark was still in prison, though that certainly helped her feel safer, but because she'd realized that his continued incarceration wasn't what gave her peace. She'd built a life that would be good, would be full, would be worth living whether he was in prison or not. She'd survived him. She'd escaped him. She'd healed enough to recognize that her value as a human being had never been determined by his treatment of her, that his abuse said everything about him and nothing about her worth. True strength isn't always loud or obvious or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet act of serving breakfast with a restraining order underneath the plate. Sometimes it's surviving one more day when every instinct tells you to give up. Sometimes it's showing up to a parole hearing years later, not for revenge, but to ensure your voice is heard. Sometimes it's the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding yourself piece by piece until you remember who you were before someone tried to erase you. If this story moved you, if you've watched someone rise from their lowest point, if you know someone still trapped in the nightmare Sydney escaped, or if you believe in the kind of justice that's built slowly through documentation and courage and refusing to stay silent, leave a comment. Tell me what strength looks like to you. Share this with someone who needs to know that escape is possible, that survival is possible, that building a life after abuse is possible. Because stories like Sydney's remind us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay broken, that you can be shattered and still rebuild, that your past doesn't define your future, and that the person who tried to destroy you doesn't get to write the ending of your story. You do.